and welcome to Comp Ed Week. I am Emily Rowan, the Marketing Manager for Rhetoric. You all are muted at this time, but you can post your questions for Johndan through the chat panel. Simply post your chat to McMillan Education, myself, or Molly Park. Johndan will address your questions at the end of the presentation. This presentation will also be recorded and posted for later viewing and downloading. So it is with great pleasure I introduce Johndan Johnson-Eilola as one of our featured speakers for Comp Ed Week. Dr. Johnson-Eilola has gained international recognition for his contributions to finding intersections between practice and theory, and is considered an expert in hypertext theory and practice, online communities, and the politics of technology. He currently works at Clarkson University and is the author of Changing Writing, a Guide with Scenarios.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Is the audio okay?
Yep, we hear you.
Okay, good. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm going to talk about some ways to design and use scenarios to teach writing. Scenarios differ from traditional academic assignments because they give students a story with some fictional elements in them. In business schools, they're sometimes called cases. So what I've been trying to do is adapt these to writing classes, and they've worked out pretty well. Scenarios aren't necessarily better or worse than a traditional assignment like writing a paper from research or a personal narrative. They're just one more tool to have in your toolbox for learning to help or helping students learn to write more effectively. I started using scenarios when I was teaching at Purdue about 20 years ago. They were part of the technical writing repertoire that Pat Sullivan and Jim Porter had developed there. The three of us later wrote the textbook Professional Writing Online, which is a web-based TechCom textbook that relied heavily on scenarios. Now, I use scenarios in a broad range of teaching contexts because I like their flexibility. They can provide a little structure or a lot of structure depending on what I think the students need to focus on for any particular assignment. So in this session, I'm going to describe how scenarios work, how they differ from traditional first-year comp assignments, and the pros and cons of each. I'll walk through a couple scenarios from Changing Writing to show you some concrete examples and highlight how the scenario approach can be helpful in classes. So I want to start with a quick anatomy to show the structure of a couple scenarios and a description of the processes that students would work through. I'll also return to several other scenarios at the end of this so I can get into more depth on specifics. I'm going to talk about what I call the get out the vote scenario first, which is where students are asked to design a text of any kind of text they can justify to encourage college students to register for voting. And the second anatomy that we'll look at is an exercise about thinking critically about media consumption. Now, both these scenarios are structured around, as are all my scenarios, a matrix of purpose, audience, context, and an eventual text. There's nothing sort of groundbreaking there. In the get out the vote scenario, the context involves a fictional person named Aunt Sheila who is going to run for Congress. It's the student's aunt. As Aunt Sheila explains it, she doesn't want help getting elected. She just wants college students to become more politically engaged. She wants them to be informed voters no matter who they vote for. So the students in the scenario are given this fictional person and a specific purpose along with a context. And we make the context the student's actual college campus so it's a little bit more organic and connected. And the audience for the scenario would be the fellow students. So the students aren't assigned a specific text to write. It could be a poster, it could be a web page, a radio announcement, whatever. So they have to do some analysis to figure out which text is going to be most successful. What the scenario structure here is doing is specifying some items so that students can be directed to think about a very complex problem. What specific type of text is most likely to be successful in getting students to register to vote? So students are given a little bit of direction in trying to resolve that issue. The resources section for a scenario might include things like links to the popular Rock the Vote website, which directly addresses the issue they're working on, and might also include as resources some articles about student engagement with politics. There's also a question section in a scenario where they're given specific questions to keep in mind, such as why don't students tend to vote? And it might also include advice to talk to students that they know about their interest or disinterest in the political process. And students are finally directed to do some original research on their own about things like where students can register locally and whether students in the state where they are can vote by absentee ballot, and if they can, how the process works. The media diary follows the same sort of structure with the purpose, audience, context, and eventual text. But in the narrative section that follows that, the students are given a fictional professor who is writing a journal article about people's experiences with new communication technologies. The professor, and in the narrative section we give him a name and some background detail, tells the class about his project and emails them a short message describing what he wants. In this case, the professor is asking for 1,500 words on using some new media technology at some earlier point in the students' lives. So the students could write about sending a text message, they could write about getting their first cell phone, or the video game rig they got for their 6th birthday. In the head note about purpose, audience, context, and text, it has a list of bulleted points that summarize some of these things, followed by this story about the professor. We would give students questions that direct them to think about writing from memory, about concrete details and emotions, and we would give them in the resources section some samples of other people writing about similar topics. So we're basically constructing a framework that directs what the students are doing and thinking about. So one important aspect of scenarios is the way that they put students into a story. They make students agents in a narrative. In a sense, this move is a variation or extension of the move away from very dry, overly academic writing assignments that once occupied writing classrooms. Scenarios provide students a stage on which they can act. They tend to have more concrete detail for the student, which makes it easier for students to understand the positions of different actors in the scenario, including, most importantly, the reader. Scenarios can lead to more active engagement for students because the scenario does part of the work for them. Rather than asking students to create a context on their own, the scenario explicitly sketches in key important details, the names of other people involved, what those people's concerns and motivations are, and what they're going to do with the text when they get it. So scenarios, in a sense, are training wheels for reality. Now, this graphic's a huge oversimplification, but if we plot scenarios on an XY space that includes an x-axis ranging from artificial to organic and a y-axis that runs from simple to complicated or complex, on this grid we might put something like write a 4-page essay on ethics and Bartley the Scrivener as an assignment on the left side, about halfway up the simple to complex range, so it's fairly artificial. On the far organic side, we'd have real-world self-motivated writing situations. So someone says, I want to make my town a better place for people who live here. I want to get elected to town council. So that organic decision would bring about a whole host of communication situations. Now, even there, agency is somewhat bounded because even on the organic side, like this local politics scenario, there are all sorts of boundaries that fall into place as soon as that writer makes that decision to run for town council. Political yard signs require brevity and clarity. Other things like ads for TV or web commercials have constraints on topics that can be addressed, genres that have to be acknowledged, and legal requirements. So these definitions are all relative. And it's not about simple versus complex. Any artificial assignment can still be very complex. Assigning someone to create an index for a book, for example, especially if you understand the complexities of professional indexing, is a very tightly bounded space. On the other hand, if you see somebody in the hallway and ask them how they feel today, that's organic but very brief and simple. So these terms are just sort of tools to think with. Scenarios can be very simple or complex, but they tend to occupy the middle ground between artificial and organic. For example, riding a bike with training wheels, that's only part of the full cycling experience. But if you ride long enough with training wheels, the hope is that you get to the point where you don't need to use them anymore. Now, this is probably the first time I've suggested that the 5-paragraph theme, introduction, 3 points, conclusion, had merit. I don't teach the 5-paragraph theme, but I can see why it came about. Education is usually about the process of helping people learn to move from artificial to organic. In a huge number of ways, education is about using artificial as a means to get to the organic. As teachers, our hope is that by the time students leave school, they'll have the skills they need to thrive in the real world. When we refer to the wider world as the quote-unquote real world, we're talking about that movement from artificial to organic. The idea is that education relies heavily on artificial situations because they structure the learning environment. They let students focus on some things while ignoring others. So that much maligned 5-paragraph theme was an attempt to provide a fairly rigid framework for practicing a small set of key writing skills: argument, transition, style, introduction, conclusion, spelling, and grammar. Now, the real problem then was that we often relied on that too heavily or too thoughtlessly. And when I say we here, I'm probably showing my age. As with all good teaching, you have to let your pedagogical purpose drive what you're doing. That's especially true for scenarios. Scenarios aren't always appropriate. Sometimes an artificial assignment is a more direct route to learning. Teaching students to write a short biographical piece after interviewing a classmate is a great icebreaker, and it can spawn useful discussions about things like concrete detail and quotation and summary. You could create a scenario that engaged in a similar activity, but if your goals for this were icebreaker and talking about concrete detail, a relatively artificial prompt is just as effective and probably more so than a detailed scenario. And if you wrote a scenario for that sort of occasion, you'd just be making extra work for yourself. You also have to let your pedagogical purpose drive how you construct a scenario. One of the dangers of creating scenarios is getting caught up in creating a rich fictional world. Sometimes I'll look up after I've created a huge set of details for a fictional character, an interesting name, biographical details like their age, and I realize I've just spent a half hour developing a character that wasn't really that important to the learning experience. As we'll see in some examples later, you need to carefully decide what elements of the scenario should be provided for the student. Some of the scenarios that I've developed try to focus on things besides textual production so that students can instead focus on things like layout, copy editing, and graphics. Now, one of the problems I've had with traditional assignments is that students tend to see them as boxes to be checked or forms in a field they just have to fill out. Assignments that lead to this type of problem often leave unspoken the complex contextual elements, the readers, the context readers are living in, their goals and constraints, and more. So as teachers, I think we hope that our students will fill those contexts in. In the real world that I talked about, after all, people have to learn how to fill those contextual elements in order to be successful. Unfortunately, especially with beginning writers, if something isn't explicitly stated, it's just not there. We assume, or we like to assume, that our students are constructing something in a rich context, a three-dimensional space over the course of time, but instead they're often just staring at a two-dimensional piece of paper or a computer screen. It's not surprising that they fail to engage with writing context because a lot of times students don't see what they're doing as being part of a writing context. So scenarios are cognitively spatial. They structure writing as movement within a space with other people over time. Sometimes in a scenario the people won't be real, but they'll be real enough. Certainly more real than the people who remain invisible to students. So scenarios are a space, and writing in them doesn't take place in a vacuum. Now that's not to say they're the only way to provide context, but they're pretty good at it because that's their primary function, providing context. There's not an easy answer to the question of how much detail needs to go into a scenario. Part of the answer depends on the complexity of the assignment and the pedagogical goal. Scenarios that students will have to work with for a longer time sometimes require more detail, or if the problem is relatively complex and out of the student's comfort zone, more detail may be necessary to help students see the key aspects of their context. And scenarios don't need to be completely fictional. For example, some of the scenarios I've constructed include fictional actors and context, but then ask the students to translate those things into their own context. So by giving the ant running for political office a name, a voice, and visual detail, the student now is given a rhetorical reason to take on the assignment. The student isn't actually reliant on whether or not they really have a relative running for political office. By virtue of being in this scenario, they have a relative who's running for political office. In fact, people in scenarios are a little bit like what usability experts and information architects call personas. Personas are highly detailed fictional characters that stand in for eventual users. Personas give a design team a common focal point for talking and thinking about the product they're designing. The team then can have conversations about how, for example, Frank is not going to be able to navigate the banking website because he only has a high school education and that doesn't equip him to understand the language being used. Or that Frank isn't going to be able to succeed in finding out his credit card balance because he's stressed out about the oddly worded error message he got when he tried to access his bank account. So fictional people in scenarios are a concrete way that each student can think about the writing problem. In fact, when you use a scenario in a class, the whole class now has a common concrete person to talk about during the discussion and critiques. Now, by sketching out writing context in a concrete way, scenarios provide boundaries that more loosely stated assignments don't. Rather than saying, for example, pick a controversial issue and write an evidence-based argument in favor of one side or the other, a scenario might say something like, write a 900-word news article that summarizes the political positions of the three candidates in the mayoral race in our city. or research and create a poster listing the ways that people on campus can recycle materials. And here's a key thing about scenarios. They give students scaffolding in the shape of rhetorical purposes. They push students towards developing specific types of context and towards seeing specific types of fictional people with their own specific types of wants and needs. Scenarios are a semi-specific framework that students build text on. Even within the scenario category, though, there's a huge continuum. You can specify as few or as many aspects of the scenario that fit your pedagogical needs. If you think it's useful to have students compare drafts to each other to explore the different ways of addressing the same problem, specifying a lot of detail makes students compare apples to apples. But if you don't like the idea of reading 50 drafts of variations on the same tight theme, give your students a little bit more room to roam by not providing as many boundaries. The scenarios that I developed for changing writing run the full spectrum. There are some very loose ones that just provide a little bit of concrete rhetorical exigency and then ask students to respond within a fairly large category. The fictional professor, for example, asks students for their personal narratives about using a new technology, lets students choose which technology to write about. A loose scenario like this pushes students towards a certain genre of text with one type of subject matter, but within that framework, there's a huge amount of space for variation. It's sort of like asking students to write a haiku about weather. It's a very structured framework and topic, but it still allows a wide range of variation. But there are also reasons for having a very tightly controlled scenario. For example, in teaching some basic design skills for students, we have scenarios that I call text boxes. Students are given a concrete fictional context, and they're handed basically a box of pieces of text that they need to assemble into something more composed. For example, a website for a budding record label. The text box for the record label scenario gives students a concrete narrative description and a collection of existing text in the resources section. But it asks students to focus on a relatively small set of skills, textual skills like copy editing and proofreading, and visual design skills involving layout and image editing. An assignment that instead asks students to create everything from scratch for the website risks letting the content creation take up more space than copy editing and visual design. So this artificial structure is a way to focus energy and time. One could go even farther, providing students with the copy edited text so that they only focus on graphic design. Or in the other direction, you can provide students with a fully laid out website that they just have to work on copy editing the text to fit within the constraints of the layout. And in general, these text boxes, when they provide text that needs to be copy edited, it's intentionally overly long and awkwardly written so the students have to practice some copy editing skills. So I want to talk for a few minutes about the general process for constructing scenarios. You start, as I said before, with a rhetorical purpose, but then you have to figure out what process and framework might get you to that goal. So you start thinking about a story that involves your pedagogical goal. If your students are the protagonists, what narrative are they part of? What's the hero of the story going to do? So there's a metaphor for thinking about this. A scenario is a slow-moving, gentle-shaped explosive charge, sort of like the explosive devices demolition experts might use. You carefully manipulate the explosive material and direct the force of the explosion in specific calculated directions. So the scenario gently nudges the students into acting in certain ways. It's a very, very slow, gentle, direct explosion. This sounds a little disempowering, I think, but it's also realistic for some students. Students who are motivated require less force. They're their own motivating force. But unmotivated students are going to require a more powerful shaped charge. Their scenarios require more structure, more detail in their stories. I think some of this metaphor comes from the fact that I turned in midterm grades yesterday, and some of my students apparently need more explosive force. Okay, so a scenario visual looks something like this at the 10,000-foot level. It has a four-part matrix: purpose, audience, context, and text. These are filled with brief 2 or 3 bulleted points each. Sometimes the text one is left empty because it's up to the student. So parts of these will be left out, and those are the parts that students will have to fill in for themselves. Then there's the narrative section where we'll put the students in the story and explain the fictional details and the actors within it, and then what their role is in it. And there's usually a section of questions to consider that asks students pointed questions about the scenario that they're just engaged with and to help them engage more fully with it. And then finally, a section of resources that might include everything from web links to things that they might read, actual readings that they do. If it's a text box, they will include pieces of text from the work in or graphics to work with. Those will all go in the resources section. So let's run through a couple of brief examples. of how you might construct something like a scenario. We start with a pedagogical goal. Let's say in this example, we want students to learn how to craft an argument based on existing data, which is a really important skill in the real world. One common way to approach this in first-year comp is obviously to have students write a research paper. And I think that's sometimes an effective approach, and it does prepare students for writing academically. But I want to talk about some of the ways we might approach this with a scenario. Just a couple of options. Let's say we write a story about, our narrative is about a student group, maybe your university's wilderness or mountaineering club, and they want to get funds from student government to buy a decent video camera. They want to document the work they've been doing to clear up trails in the state park. Now, for me, I would situate that someplace locally like the Adirondacks or maybe some High Peaks trails. And you'd obviously want to look to similar areas in your local context to tie the students more directly to the scenario. So for the scenario, I might write a narrative about that situation and then provide students with reviews of 5 different cameras and tell them they needed to write a 1,000-word proposal to their student government organization. And they have to use one or more of those reviews to propose buying a specific camera to justify the cost they're going to pay. I normally write the narrative first, and then I would go back to the problem, audience, context, and purpose label second as the head note. And then as I'm working on the narrative, I would find reviews, and I would dump them into the resources section. Now, as part of the narrative for this scenario, I tell students they need to create a set of criteria that evaluate each camera for the intended purpose in categories like cost, performance, battery life, etc. If I wanted to make this scenario a smaller project, I might make the scenario more limited and ask the students just to come up with that criteria matrix on their own and not actually write the proposal. If I wanted to make this a larger, more complex project, I would have the students write the whole proposal, coming up with not only the criteria matrix, but asking them to deal with constructing the broader argument about why the video camera is a good choice in the first place. For example, one obvious question is, why not just use your iPhone to record video? Why is a better camera necessary? What does that buy you? Questions like that might go into the questions to consider section. Now, we could take this in a different direction. We could have students deal with a complicated social issue, and we could have them write a story about a student wanting to bring a guest speaker to campus to talk about income inequality. In the scenario, we would give students some material to work with in the resources section, like graphs on income disparity over the last few decades, links to U.S. Census data sites, including possibly some interactive exploration, and then maybe some readings on the working poor, and the biographies of a couple of different speakers who might talk about that topic. So we populated our 4-part matrix at the top with bullet points describing those issues. And in the narrative, we can have the students write a 1-page letter to the Dean of Students asking for $1,000 to cover the cost of bringing a speaker to campus. Then we write the narrative. What specific position you take will depend on your student demographics and your own interest. But for now, let's say we have adopt a fairly organic narrative of a roommate of a student talking about his sister's struggle to support her family while working at minimum wage. The reading itself can go into the resources section, and the narrative could describe the student being shocked to find out the conditions that affect some working poor. In our questions to consider section, we could ask students to look at the data or use the census website to find out more information about your local context. Or we could ask the students to investigate what resources the campus has to support guest speakers, or if there's an office on campus that might offer help bringing someone to campus to give a talk. We might even arrange for someone from that office to actually come to our class and speak to students about what's involved in bringing a speaker to campus, how those decisions are made about whether or not to fund a guest speaker. So you can also vary the type of text, maybe asking students instead to create a poster or a web ad for the talk. So you switch things around in a scenario based on getting at what you want to teach. Okay, I want to turn in a little bit more detail to 3 example scenarios. The teamwork problems scenario focuses on collaboration or argumentation. The writing a restaurant review scenario focuses on genre, audience, and style. And designing a newsletter is a text box that focuses on graphic design and copy editing. And these scenarios vary in terms of how complex and organic they are. Both the teamwork problems and the newsletter give students a lot of the raw content and some pretty specific directions about the players in that context. The restaurant review, though, is a little more organic because it takes something students already do to some extent. They go to restaurants and talk about the food that they eat. Structuring this as a formal restaurant review for a local newspaper or magazine website makes the assignment slightly artificial, but it's still within believable bounds. It still rings true. All these are at mid-levels of complexity, but what's complex for one class is going to be different than what's complex for another class, so you have to evaluate that on your own. If the students have already covered some graphics fundamentals, for example, in an earlier project, laying out the newsletter might not be too difficult. If they've already written something that resembles mass market journalism, translating those skills to writing a restaurant review might not be very challenging. So you always be adjusting your expectations about the quality of the work and how much time you're going to need to devote to it in class. Now, you can also grab a chunk of a scenario and use it for some other purpose. As we'll soon look at the teamwork problem scenario, it might be useful to have students just look at the description and then discuss in class in small groups what strategies they might pursue. So in the teamwork scenario, you take a group of 3 or 4 actual students in your class and you put them into a team for this project. And the scenario describes to them the problem of having one extra fictional team member who's not providing the work they're supposed to do. The students in the resources section are given a collection of texts, mostly email messages among themselves and the problematic student, and text messages. And they're also given a copy of the class's grading policy, which says that students get the same grade for team projects unless there are issues. And the scenario asks the students to write an email to the professor, drawing on those existing texts to make a case for changing the grading policy. Now, you could also go the other way with the scenario and not specify that students have to write an email. You could open it up a little by asking them what medium they'd like to address this situation with. Should it be email? Should it be face-to-face meeting with a professor? You could also give students the option between addressing a problematic student one last time in an email or going to the professor and have them justify that. So one of the important aspects of scenarios is that you can add this metacognitive work along with the scenario, either during the process or after. I always ask my students to think about the reasons they made the rhetorical moves they did. Why did they choose to adopt a specific structure or textual style? Why did they put this graphic there? Why did they choose this font? How did they think their specific audience was going to respond to these rhetorical moves? Part of this metacognitive push is to get students just to think about what they're doing, but it's also helpful to an instructor because this helps me evaluate the project. If students have a good understanding of what they need to do, but they execute poorly, that means I focus my comments in one direction. I'm going to give them a little bit more credit, whereas a student who has just made poor assumptions about the whole project needs a different kind of help and they get a little bit less credit than somebody who had good ideas but poor execution. So I want to give them some credit for understanding what was going on in the writing context, even if they couldn't execute the way they needed to. Now, the second scenario we're going to look at is a restaurant review. This fictional scenario in the narrative talks about a friend inviting a student. The friend works for a local magazine, and they want to know if the student will write a review of a restaurant for the magazine's weblog. So the student is asked to choose a restaurant out in their actual community and to write a review that includes 3 photos. You can also make this a teamwork project, and the benefit of that is that they can write a restaurant right because they have multiple dishes to taste. It's also a good sort of social activity for your students in a more relaxed and more realistic setting than the classroom. Now, it's fairly straightforward and bounded. It's designed to get students to think about genre, textual style, and a little bit of graphic design because it asks them to provide photos. The scenario asks students to think about genre, and we give them in the resources section existing restaurant reviews, and the questions section asks students to examine the tone, the structure, the use of graphics, the place of narrative reviews, and things like that. The scenario also asks students to be self-critical about how they choose what restaurants they like to eat in. What things, for example, lead to a positive experience and what lead to a negative experience? Students can think about things beyond just the taste of the food. So they can look at, for example, the speed of service. Is it rushed? Is it just right? Is it too slow? The atmosphere of a restaurant, loud, quiet, or stuffy, and the student's own purposes for visiting a restaurant. Is it a relaxing dinner with a special friend? Is it a quick bite between classes? Is it a birthday party? All these things will affect the subjective experiences of visiting a restaurant. Okay, so the last scenario we're going to look at in detail is another text box. It's like the record label website, but it's focused on a slightly different set of context, and audience, and purposes. In this scenario, students are given a fictional aunt and uncle who have a vegetable stand at the Zealand Farmers Market, and the aunt and uncle also serve on the Market's Advisory Board. The board decides they want to publicize the market more effectively by having a newsletter, but they don't have the skill to develop one or the time. They do, however, have raw materials on hand for the newsletter, things like drafts of articles, pictures, recipes, clip art, things like that, and that's provided in the resources section. And the student is told that they have offered to create the first issue of the newsletter using those materials. So, like most scenarios, a lot of decisions have been made for the student ahead of time. They're told you're going to work on this newsletter. Another way to make student decisions for students is to have them scenario tie the student to a fictional job on campus. So for example, maybe they don't want to write a press release, but they don't really have a choice unless they want to risk losing the job that they rely on for beer money. So that's a way to make decisions for students to structure what they're doing. Now, things like graphic design have been showing up in writing classrooms for decades, and I think to some extent that's a really positive thing. I try to get my students to see writing as just one type of a larger activity of communication and design. Writing is often a crucial component of design, but there are also other areas that might be more effective given a specific context, audience, and purpose. If you see the whole world as alphanumeric, it's a little limiting. Now, I know there's not enough time to teach everything we need to have to teach, and it's a delicate balance. So the newsletter scenario tries to give students the chance to practice some basic design skills that are covered in readings they do. And there's writing involved, but it's limited to the practice of copy editing text. Now, this type of activity, working with pre-manufactured material, shows up in the real world in many different forms. It's not just newsletter design, but things like weblogs, playlists, curated collections, music festivals, even mundane but everyday activities like writing corporate documents from boilerplate that the legal department has approved. People are increasingly valued for their skills at remixing existing content, so this sort of scenario gives them practice at that. So I want to end with just a few tips, things that we have covered. First, as always, don't lose sight of the pedagogical purpose. Second, adapt scenarios so they fit your students. If you're developing your own scenarios, don't forget that you can also adapt something you did for class a year ago to another class and change it to fit the specific class. And it's important to give yourself some flexibility. Sometimes I'll switch a scenario from an individual assignment to a team assignment if I think I need to get the students talking to each other. But I also might switch a team scenario to an individual one if I think the class is getting too socialized and rowdy. I'll often change the boundaries of a scenario as well. If I want students to focus on something different, I might shift the type or genre of text they're creating. I might take a scenario that asks students to develop a web banner ad and then instead ask them to create a script for a 30-second radio PSA for the campus radio station. Or I might ask them to convert a short personal narrative they wrote earlier into a chapter of a graphic novel or a series of tweets. So you can pick the text type that you think teaches whatever skill you want to get at, graphic design, textual production, audio production, script writing, or just tight editing skills to fit into that 140 character limit. And finally, scenarios are really useful as class discussions, with teams taking a piece of a scenario and just discussing it in class, but not actually having to produce the text. So I think scenarios have given me a broader set of tools for helping my students learn to write text of all types. They've given me a way to provide additional strategic structure to assignments in ways that push students towards specific kinds of thinking and writing and designing. So that's all I have today, but I think we have a little time for discussion. If you have a comment or a question or an experience to share, you can type it into the chat window, and our moderator will read it back to everyone.
I had a couple of questions about the scenarios that John Dan was referring to, and are both the ones that you spoke about in the actual textbook, so they could use the Launchpad Solo link I just sent via chat to access that? So if you will see, I did put that link in the chat feature in the window. And so you can use that link to see examples of the scenarios that John Dan is referring to and that he uses in changing writing.
Yeah, I should apologize. I just saw the note about slowing down, which is a problem I always have. The PowerPoint that we're going to post is has all my speaking notes in it, so I more or less just read from it. So if you have problems following any of this, you could download that and read the speaker's notes embedded in it.
Also, you'll see on the page that Johndan did include his email address, and so feel free to take advantage of that. Or if you have questions specifically about his book, how you get it for students, or how your students get access to Launchpad Solo, please feel free to send me an email. I'm going to drop my email into the chat window as well. So 1 second. We do have a question while I'm typing this. The question is, do you find yourself using scenarios more in certain courses than others? I guess so this person's asking, like, if he teaches a business writing class, could you see that being applicable as well as a composition class?
Yeah, the initial context I learned to use scenarios in and to write scenarios was Purdue's business and tech writing program. So we used that for the required business and tech writing classes that most of the students at the university had to take. That was sort of where the idea came from, I think, because places like Harvard Business School were sort of famous for having developed cases that look a lot like scenarios. So I think it worked well for that. Scenarios are generally good when students need more structure. So they work pretty well at the introductory level. As students get more advanced and more comfortable writing, they generally start to more organically engage with writing assignments. They come up with their own assignments, and they motivate themselves. But that's always a moving target. So, you know, when somebody's in their first year of graduate school, they might be a good writer, but when they start to deal with a complex situation that's out of their comfort zone, a scenario can provide them with the support or framework they need to learn to write more effectively in that new area.
Michael has 2 questions, Johndan. The first one is, do you ever have problems with students resisting the scenarios you create? And following that question is, if you do, how do you deal with that student resistance?
I've only had problems, oddly, in I talked briefly about personas, which are the things that, say, web designers or product developers build. When I've taught classes in that area, the students resisted using the personas, which are sort of a limited version of a scenario, partly because they were extremely hardcore computer science type students, and they saw that as touchy-feely. I don't have as many problems with using this in other writing classes because the students, it feels a little bit weird at first to be talking about a fictional person that's your aunt or whatever, or your aunt and uncle, or a cousin, or a local business owner that doesn't really exist. But they get comfortable with it after the first 1 or 2.
There was another question for me that I was talking too quickly whenever I was explaining the book in Launchpad. So once again, if you have questions about changing writing, you can send me an email or about how to access the scenarios. I'm happy to help any of you do that.
Okay, another question from Mike Sag asked if I use scenarios in argumentative writing course. I think that would, I've not taught a course just on argumentative writing, but frequently one of the sub-assignments that I'll do, there'll be a module on argumentative writing. One of the scenarios that fit well with that are ones that give the students the text box. So if you give students a bunch of data about, I think we talked before about the income inequality scenario, that would be a really excellent example for argumentative writing if you're trying to teach students how to argue from data, which is something that I find students struggle a lot. When you give them data, they don't understand that they need to actually do something with the data. They'll say things like the data speaks for itself. Data speaks for itself. But when you have a scenario like that, you can sort of force students to have to grapple with that data and extract things from it and use it to construct a logical argument. So yeah, I think scenarios are sort of a natural for that kind of argumentative writing.
Okay, well, we appreciate time for all of you for your time and for attending Comp Ed Week. So please follow up with us if you have any questions afterwards, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.